Okay. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to the annual Loeb GSD lecture. The fellowship sponsors this lecture every year at the end of the year, just as we're orienting our new fellows and having our annual alumni council meeting. So I need to do a couple of Loeb business matters for just a second. First of all, the curators in the house. Bill Doble is here. Bill? And secondly, the newest members of the Loeb family are here, the class of 2013. Please stand up so we can give you an appropriate welcome. That's great. So now for the main business of the evening, and that is to introduce my friend Rahul Mehrotra, who will give our address tonight. Officially, Rahul is the professor of urban design and planning and a chair of our urban planning and design department. His CV reveals that he has taught at the University of Michigan, as well as MIT. Prior to coming here, he's written over 11 books, and he has an active architectural practice based in Mumbai. None of those are the reason we ask him to speak tonight. We ask him to speak tonight because of his passion. People often ask me to describe the typical Loeb Fellow, and there is no such thing, of course. But one thing is true of all Loeb Fellows, and that is passion. You care deeply about the nature of our cities and of our natural environment, and you spend your energies and your time working tirelessly to make those places better. And that's who Rahul is. He is passionate about several things, about excellent design. You're going to see some of that tonight. From the smallest project, tiny art galleries in Mumbai, to a large laboratory building in Basel, from the newest, a striking office building in Hyderabad, I think you'll probably see tonight, to the oldest, a stunning restoration of the Chowmalhala Palace in Hyderabad, from the humblest, an inventive toilet in the slums of Mumbai, public toilet, to the most prestigious, a master plan for preserving the Taj Mahal. He's passionate about his city of Mumbai. When he found there were no planners in the governing structure of Mumbai, he created the Mumbai Design Research Institute and directed it for 10 years, that has tried to provide planning skills to the city of Mumbai. When he takes studios to Mumbai, he leaves behind a book with the ideas there that can be useful to the people of that city. When we went with him to Mumbai last year, we met with his friends, the people who value his opinions and work to be as committed as he is, everywhere from the community organizers of Pukar and Slum Dwellers International to the First Minister of Maharashtra, the state in which Mumbai is located. And finally, Rahul is passionate about the education for students at this school. I'm going to read this. In the 2 years that he's been here, he has invented and is coordinating a year-long course called Cities by Design. He's co-taught 2 courses on critical conservation of historic buildings and places, taught the Urban Design Pro Seminar, taught a studio on Mumbai each semester, activated a group to plan a new course on housing and urbanism, presided over the renovation of the urban planning curriculum, led his department through a difficult accreditation process, and hired some great new faculty. He cares deeply and has passion about how we educate young planners. This talk has traditionally been given by an alumna or an alumnus of the Loeb Fellowship Program. This is the first time we've invited somebody without that status. I know you will agree with me that Rahul shares that trait of passion with all of us Loebs, a person who cares deeply about our cities and wants to make them serve all their occupants with sustainability, with beauty, and with justice. Welcome, Rahul.
Good evening, and thanks, Jim. Thanks very much for those kind words. Really, thank you. And for me, it's really a pleasure to do this talk. I haven't shared my work here at the GSD, and so when Jim sort of invited me to do this, I said the only condition would be if I could talk about my architecture for a change and not planning in cities, and he agreed, and so I took this on. So thanks again for that. And I'm sort of really delighted that the Loeb Fellowship has grown so close to the mainstream of the school in this last year or two, and it's really been very important for the GSD and for all of us, and especially in our department, where these alignments sort of map on much more accurately. And it's really been fantastic working with you all, and really a warm welcome to all the new Loebs who are coming in. Tonight I'm going to sort of talk to you about my experiences of working in Mumbai, but I use that emblematically as the influence of the city as a generator of our practice. I mean, you can take me out of the city, but you can't take the city out of me. And I think the influences of just working in Mumbai have been profound on our practice, and I want to share that connection with you, and want to acknowledge a few people from my studio happen to be here today. Romil, who's been associated with our firm, Nandita, Charles, and Sean. And it's really nice that there are many friends here that I can share this with today. The way I've sort of structured this, it's in 3 parts. I'm going to share with you for the first 15 or 20 minutes issues that I think have been important for me, things that one has observed, worked with. And then I'm going to sort of share with you 2 sets of projects, one under what I call the rubric of global programs that are finding their way through the globalization process to India, and others which are what I call local programs that generate out of the contingencies, problems, questions, issues of the locality. And so I'm sort of bunching these projects under that umbrella. But really working in Mumbai is about negotiating, or those experiences is about negotiating a landscape where global flows don't really erase and remake landscapes, but are forced to really occupy local fissures, creating fascinating hybrid conditions and startling adjacencies. And that's really what characterizes physically a condition of the city. And being based in Mumbai and working in the city is unlike being based in other regional centers in India, where the imposition of a region-specific cultural agenda on its architects may demand that they conform to demonstrate their regional credentials and expectations of what an architect might have to do in society. However, working in Mumbai in many ways is, thus far at least, guaranteed to a degree of conceptual freedom that permits a kind of modulation between tradition, contemporary values, in permutations that one which are far more open-ended. It's also a place and a site where changes begin to manifest themselves much ahead of many other parts of the country. And as my colleague here, Yves Blau, has sort of described the conditions of East Europe and places like India, where you have these multiple transitions that are simultaneously in play, one that is into capitalism and then one that is out of socialism. And these are playing simultaneously. And so in that period, as an architect, you're compelled, in a sense, to engage with a much wider landscape. And you're compelled to actually construct a hybrid form of practice, because you have to deal with both. You can't absolve yourself the responsibility of responding to either one of those conditions. And in many ways, this idea of the non-aligned, which is a third way, is one that resonates when one describes some of these engagements. And so I think these were the sorts of issues, and this is how I've organized my observations on my experiences as a preface to the work. One is sort of this idea of research as advocacy. And the early stages of our practice, rather accidentally, Jim mentioned the books and the research, which became an integral part of the practice. I mean, I didn't see it as being different from the practice. And this was triggered off in part as an exercise to support advocacy work that we began to get involved in the city, but also the way of thinking through some of these problems that were hard to grapple with on account of the lack of literature or archival material, especially in a city the size of Mumbai. It's remarkable. I mean, my studio students have experienced this, that when you work there, the dearth of information is mind-boggling. And so it was contingent again upon us to construct this. These were self-initiated projects where money was raised. Sometimes a publishing entity was put into place just to construct these books. A lot of it doesn't necessarily qualify for scholarship, but was a localized effort and often intuitive arguments about issues in the city. And this work focused very much on the issues that surrounded us in the city, its physical and social well-being being central to this agenda. And the fallout of this work was interesting. Some of it led to legislative measures, and some of it led to legislative measures and also spawned institutional structures and group research. We also began to engage with documentation, that is measuring and beginning to learn again how to put your hands down, to touch something, to scale it, to represent it, was so fundamental, especially in this age where technology sort of override our own intuitions sometimes. And some of this documentation became accumulative and led to legislation. This was the first legislation to protect heritage precincts in India. This was the first one in India, which came out of some of these efforts of our research sort of engagement. And the documentation was sort of widespread. We were involved with historic buildings. I'm not going to talk about those today because that's a lecture in itself, but Jim alluded to some of this, but actually measuring these buildings where there was no information and the hundreds of drawings that were constructed as a result of this. And so I think this research and engagement with the issues of the city, its governance, led us to understand that the notion of significance as something that is continuously made and constructed. It gave us agency to sort of grapple with these conditions, historic places in different ways. And that significance is not about discovery or articulation as much it's about engagement and construction and making. In fact, in cities like Mumbai, meanings are not stable. Even the name changes, as you know. And here spaces and images get consumed, reinterpreted, recycled. And this is this amazing Ganesh festival, which takes place for 10 days every year, where this temporal event is really a spectacle that challenges architecture as being the sole spectacle of the city. And in these societies, architecture is not the only spectacle by which cities sort of define their identity. And there are many other enacted moments like this that are perhaps as powerful, and there are hundreds of festivals, some that play out at a smaller scale, some at a larger scale, like this one, where about 5 million people participate for those 10 days every year. And also spaces get consumed. I was talking earlier to Helen Marriage, who was talking about how when she organizes these events in London, it takes 5 years to set up the condition to block off streets. In these 10 days in Mumbai, entire neighborhoods are cut off from traffic. They become auditoriums, they become collective community spaces. They get defined by these lights. Spaces get constructed. And so these meanings sort of shift. The other question was always how one softens thresholds, because in conditions like these with rapid urbanization, the centrifugal forces of urbanism has created sort of unprecedented densities where the presence of humans in urban space is overwhelming. And thus in this condition, for anyone dealing with spatial arrangements, thresholds and adjacencies between people become crucial. And it's actually, through these densities, a kind of symbiosis between these different worlds is quite natural. It occurs because there's a kind of rejection and affinity that's at play simultaneously. It's a synergetic relationship in spite of the disparities in the form. But it also raises huge questions of equity because you have disparities that are really mind-boggling, as most of you who've been there or looked at images know. So for a practitioner, the question of social access and its clear relationship to ways in which spatial arrangements are articulated becomes a question that at least we became highly sensitized to, and that people were an important component in the urban and architectural scenery that we were arranging and rearranging. In fact, I describe Mumbai as a kinetic city, and the kinetic city is not necessarily the city of the poor, as most images might suggest. Rather, it's a temporal articulation and occupation of space, which not only creates a richer sensibility of spatial occupation, but also suggests how spatial limits can be expanded to include formerly unimagined uses in dense conditions for both the rich and the poor. And these are these amazing weddings that happen around these cricket pitches, and the pitch is, of course, not touched because it's sacred ground, and it kind of wraps around. And by the morning, it sort of disappears. But this sort of sense of elasticity in the city is sort of really critical. And in fact, like I said, in these dense conditions, the symbiosis exists naturally, but in suburban conditions, spatial articulations have even a greater role to play in terms of softening these thresholds. And we'll now begin to start looking at some design work. And this is sort of in the suburban areas of Mumbai, for example, you have these sort of villas that are sprouting up for the rich. And these are sort of based on the colonial pattern as opposed to the courtyard type where ostentation is internal versus is being displayed. And this was not even built by an architect. I remember meeting the contractor, and he said the client gave him a photograph of the White House in Washington and said, do the closest thing you can. And these have large compound walls. They have, bollards along the driveways. You feel you're landing on an airport strip, and they have, beware of dog signs. But these are gated sort of villa enclaves. And so then can you actually work around this? And so we attempted that because as a practitioner starting out there, our first commissions were houses for urban people who wanted to build weekend places in these rural kind of locations. And so in this house, for example, we made a gesture of generosity, and of course the client was enlightened enough to understand it, where the living room of the house was a big veranda, and the chairs all go in, it gets closed, and this space is a gift to the villagers with the tap, so while they're not there for most of the year, the villagers can actually inhabit it. I've even seen a wedding occurring there, the caretaker and his friends, etc. But it's a way of softening the threshold, and these signals in architecture, I believe, are really important. And so that's the space that's sort of a gift to the village, whereas the bedrooms, etc., are more secure. They face a garden, with all the paraphernalia, what a suburban house might be. And so this was another example where we built a house in an orchard in Ahmedabad, outside Ahmedabad, and instead of placing the house in the periphery of the orchard, like most of these houses are, which is a part of the colonial paradigm, we decided to place the house absolutely in the center of the orchard with a natural water body there, which without chlorination, which serves as a lap pool for the residents when they come there on the weekend or once a month. But then it becomes a pool for washing the fruit, which the workers in the orchard can use. And so by changing that relationship of the master's house commanding the orchard versus it becoming a kind of working unit within the orchard, I think begins to signal different things. And this is the water pool, so it's photogenic, it's a lap pool which people enjoy. They enjoy the courtyard, the privacy, but when they go away, there's another door which allows access to the villagers, and you can unplug this and it charges the well. So there's no filtration or chlorination plant in the house, and you have a separate entrance. So the workers then occupy, and they have a different association with the space, and they appropriate it, so to speak, for most of the year. And so I think these are little ways in which these spatial arrangements can be modulated. This is a house we've done on a tea plantation where they bought this acre or two and they wanted to remove the tea and make gardens, but we convinced them to keep the tea in its natural setting. And we kind of rejigged the image of the house. In fact, locally it's called the tea factory, which is very nice because it's not associated as the house of rich people, but rather people think it's a tea factory. And the production of tea sort of goes on. And of course, it's a very sensitive landscape. So placing the house through, low-cost mock-ups like this, responding to what might be the ecology, the drainage patterns in this location, but also bringing to bear the sophistication that urban people might require. I'm sorry, this is a bit burnt out, but essentially it's a wall right at the edge of the property with 3 or 4 rooms, which are independent boxes, which are sort of treated differently with a big veranda. That's an entrance portico, which you come into, and a glass tube that takes you there. So it's very transparent, and it doesn't it doesn't give out the signals of being something that's sort of cut off from that terrain, but rather transparent and therefore visually accessible, and a working tea plantation. So this sort of symbiosis between these two completely different cultures, where urban cultures are coming to bear on a kind of suburban condition and threatening in some ways, is sort of dissipated by softening, I believe, these thresholds visually. Then the question of building ecology, and that's one that's really, really important because I think sustainable design, as we begin to see it, it should be a combination of social ecologies, economies, and physical design, and this sort of gets siloed in our debates. And in fact, Moisen isn't here, but one of his early books called Weathering was very insightful, and I learned a lot from it and realized that our debates have become about weatherproofing. They're not about weathering. And so our materials and the selection of materials don't account for weathering. Rather, all the emphasis is on sealants and double insulation. And so so weathering has moved to weatherproofing, which means we've really taken climate out of the equation and out of the discussion. And so therefore, the palette of materials that we've shifted to also has responded to that shift in mindset in the way we sort of look at this. And so I think that is an important reminder because it, I think, opens up a whole world, not only in terms of material textures, but it's a critical question when we talk about sustainability and these broader ecologies. And also, of course, there's a question of incrementalism, which is something I think in the condition of India we were very sensitized to. And I just have this image here because these are the sachets to sell shampoo and betel nut that Procter & Gamble invented, recognizing the bottom of the pyramid as the biggest market. And this sort of creative attitude or response to incrementalism is something that we as planners and architects haven't really picked up on. And I mean, in India, we are always, when I started my practice, things are now better with the economy, but 20 years ago, you were always afraid that your building would stop halfway. So we began designing buildings such that even if they ran out of money halfway, it didn't look incomplete. And so we sort of always were preempting or anticipating this sort of extreme condition. And so this sort of imagination of design also as incremental, I think, is something that we very much sort of picked up on. And the social as one of the materials of architecture that we cannot escape working with. I think if we talk about sustainability and we don't talk about the social as material, it can't be the only material, but it has to be something that we have to articulate a much finer debate around because its implications on the organizational aspects of buildings is as much as technology and more obvious material components that actually make the building. And I believe the rating example or the rating approach when we talk about climate is how this broader, the whole idea of LEED, for example, is how this broader ecology of building is ignored in the quest for focusing on material. And I think the rating in particular tends to perhaps unwittingly create a hegemony of the US codes universally. And we deal with this in India all the time. And I'll show you some buildings which failed miserably on the codes, but I think they were the right solutions. These ratings do not lead to more, I believe, to more ecological solutions, as what they do is to provide really a chemical or a mechanical fix to any design problem to meet the rating requirements. So the debate is about more efficient air conditioning, better sort of insulation. It's a chemical and mechanical fix. So it's like setting up the problem and then trying to find the solution. Can't we go back to fundamentals? And I think you actually witness an entire green industry developing around this. And I think even places like India, now there's this incredible emphasis through the green industry to impose the ratings. Of course, there's a lot of opposition to it too, so they're beginning to tweak it. I'm exaggerating this, but I think it's a real issue. Because it's eventually a question of lifestyle that will determine the success of our ability to respond spatially in achieving sustainable design paradigms. And I think really what happened was the high-techs stole the debate about sustainability. And so it had to land where it has landed, which is a debate about mechanical and chemical fixes. Because I think now, and we have students here at the GSD, Dan Weisman, others who are working on this question of how new technologies can actually inform the processes of low-tech. Because I think part of the problem with low-tech was that you worked through traditional wisdom or intuitively in finding solutions. But new forms of technology, representation, etc., can inform the debate on low-tech much more substantially to create new forms of interface. And so, for example, for me in Mumbai, the monsoon is always an amazing moment after blistering heat for 3 or 4 months when these clouds arrive around the 7th of June, this sort of silky sky, and it sort of explodes. There's an amazing sort of renewal of life, but it's also incredibly threatening because then, everything's going to leak and things are going to flood and people are also paranoid. And so it's this kind of double-edged sword. And I think it's a wonderful moment in Mumbai, but I think in other places there are other extreme forms of climate, which I think have escaped our debate completely because, again, we've moved from weathering to weatherproofing. And then how does one actually design celebrating this moment of the monsoon's arrival? And that's something that interests us very much. And again, I'm not going to get into details, but I just wanted to sort of flag that off. The next sort of issue is what I call crafting tradition. And this has to do with, I think, a misunderstanding of what craft might be. Because I think as discussions about sustainability have been preempted by high technology, so craft, or the new craft of architecture, especially in the West, builds on the idea of the complete disappearance of traditional craft. However, in the context of a place like India, craft is yet continuous and an alive tradition. In fact, in India, after agriculture, craft is the largest occupation, of which a bulk is construction. But it does not register with the government as craft. It's defined as labor. So you're looking at it as labor. And I think this is really problematic because craft is seen both by architects and the government as the perpetuation of traditional crafts or vernacular traditions. And to craftspeople are seen as extending these traditions and are often from traditional craft producing communities. So it's sort of a real box, and that's not allowed crafts, I believe, to evolve. Because craft people in contemporary building processes are never discussed either because their skills are not manifest in traditional forms or are not used to perpetuate traditional forms, a kind of vernacularism, so to speak, aesthetically. And so neither are they perceived as inheritors of community tradition or craft practice if they engage with new forms. And I think this is something that has interested us in terms of addressing. And that sort of means metal and looking at hardware, masonry, which have traditionally been learned through apprenticeship, but I think, and also had religious affiliations, but I think in pre-capitalist economies, but I think now the time is come that we can, I think, engage with that in more substantial ways and manifest it, because we boast of our living traditions, but pay insufficient attention to how these can be extended. And I think for us, that's a really important question. And we've tried in our buildings to sort of engage with that in our conservation work. Of course, it's a no-brainer because you have all those traditions alive and you can extend them. But in contemporary buildings, how do you begin to bring these crafts back into practice? I mean, we've experimented with even lime, using traditional methods of camels grinding the lime and using the 3 months that's required to build one column like that because of the slow process with very simple instruments. You also have traditions where entire temples are built in using those traditional methods. And how can you begin to actually incorporate that without referring directly or literally to the kind of aesthetics that they've traditionally provided? And also there's a question of the life cycle of materials. And I think that's a question that through our conservation work we've been very interested in. So this is just a house we've done, recognizing that the base of the building might last for 50 years because it's rooted in the foundations, it grows out of the soil, but everything above as a superstructure might change as technologies change. So you sort of don't appropriate high technology completely, but you begin to layer it differently. And I think, so the lessons through conservation back into the contemporary practice is at many levels. It's understanding practices, it's also understanding how materials weather, and understanding how materials weather is related to crafts. And I think this is something that needs much, much greater discussion. Then, of course, the question of the local and global. And I think, we've always heard think globally and act locally. Unfortunately, today the world is the most powerful people in the world are people who think locally but have the ability and power to act globally. And so there's a complete inversion. And so that's the reason I've sort of divided the next part of this talk into local programs and global programs, because I believe the real challenge is how do you localize global programs and how do you globalize local programs? And I think this is a very interesting question for me, absolutely. And here, for example, the presence of the ancient, the presence of religion in the way it's related to craft making and building is very important. There's a resurrection of what we call Vastu, which is Feng Shui. And it's amazing how this has become a full-blown practice in India. And I would say 90% of our buildings actually have incorporated this. And what does that mean? How do you, why do you resist it, or how do you resist it? Because it's actually quite abstract. It doesn't stipulate form at all. It only stipulates location. And the practice of Vastu in its popularity are clearly bringing a new conservatism, in a sense, to the realm of architecture and the innovation of form, without necessarily challenging the emerging vocabulary and imagery of global identities. And so it's interesting how one is challenged by how one can actually embed this in the work. And then the last sort of set of observations is just a question that has interested us, which is this question of models of practice. Because, as I said, I shared with you this idea of the simultaneous transitions, and to engage with a broader spectrum means different ways of engagement and communication and representations and modes of operation. Like I said with the Vastu, I mean, that is another whole mode and how you bring it in. Sometimes these practices become hybrids, where sometimes you are issuing incredibly accurate instructions, which you can even do globally, and sometimes that doesn't work. You have to engage with craftspeople on the ground. And so these are different models that sometimes are in play simultaneously, including models where you have to self-initiate projects, and I think this is something we discuss a lot here. How can one train students to see the opportunity in that entire spectrum, from self-initiated projects, working for NGOs, the government, bigger agencies like the World Bank? It's all simultaneously valid, and one has to find ways of engaging with this. And so my latest book, and this is not a book pitch, but I just want to lead to one question, is one that looked at these different models of practice in India, and it was the 20 years, which is the 20 years of my own practice. And so it was a way of understanding and articulating more sharply what I meant by these models of practice. And just sort of a quick moment on this, that in India, what happened was from our independence to the 70s or 80s, you had this architectural spine of awareness, which went from Chandigarh, Delhi, Mumbai, petered out near Goa, Ahmedabad, and Mumbai. And this is where modernism sort of played itself out. And with Loeb and Louis Kahn and Doshi and Charles Correa and that whole generation of architects. Now, from the 90s, once we liberalized our economy, you have another spine developing, which has no foundation of the modernist traditions that existed in that spine of architecture. And this is tabula rasa. So this is being made like cities around the world are being made by globalization, like the Chinese cities. These are places that are growing, that are founded on the ideologies of capitalism only. And so these are two completely different landscapes which are exploding as our other cities grow. And there's a completely different attitude in these two zones. Our work has largely been in Bombay, but for some fortunate reason in this zone. And it's been very interesting, and that's why one has actually confronted these various models of practice, sensibilities, and sets of values on which architecture is premised. And that's how the book began to discern some of that. But I think this idea has been something that we've been very sort of aware of, sensitive to, and tried to work around. And so self-initiated projects, for example, when that conservation legislation came through, we felt, again, it was contingent upon us to take it to its next level. So we invented a festival to conserve the area, and like that parking lot, you see the paving, street furniture. This all came out of these series of events that were created. But from that, we also led ourselves to engaging. That's the parking lot I showed you. This is an art district in Mumbai, which we positioned as an art district, as a strategy to actually conserve it and to raise the income to conserve it. And within that is a large museum, which is the Prince of Wales Museum, which was actually detached from this area. And we began to get engaged with them and began to initiate a series of projects where we found a warehouse which was 50,000 square feet and found ways of opening it up to add a visitor center, again, to make that threshold softer between the art district and the museum, which has its own sort of restrictions or constraints in terms of what it can engage with. And so this was the museum, that was the warehouse, which had only one entrance, no windows. It was 50,000 square feet. And in this little notch, we suggested they add a veranda, which would create an interesting set of circulation routes, which would make it part of the art district, because now it's become art galleries, and that's a massive amount of art space that has been sort of included. So this is the little veranda we added. We renovated a stair, and you suddenly got wonderful opportunities to circulate within this and created a sort of a whole facility, and it became part of the infrastructure. But again, bringing conservation sensibilities to bear. It's reversible. It's free of the historic building. It's a contemporary intervention. This is about 10 years old now. And similarly, quite recently, we managed to realize, again, a self-initiated project, which was this visitor center, which was wrapped around an existing block as a very light stainless steel canopy incorporating the existing trees to kind of make an entranceway. That's where the baggage is given. It's all very discrete and abstract because it's always sort of hard to respond to a powerful piece of architecture like that. And this has become a new piece of infrastructure again for the museum. And these were self-initiated in the sense that the museum didn't have a master plan. We set in as part of the conservation plan to begin to initiate, help with fundraising, and develop this infrastructure. With this, I sort of move into the second part, which is the global programs. And so this is a project we did for India's biggest machine tool company in 1994, 95, when our liberalization of our economy had just sort of begun. And of course, they called me in. I was young, just starting my practice. And they said they knew exactly what they wanted. They had a 40 by 100 meter site. They wanted a high-rise tower. They had a collaborator in Australia who was going to give them a license to bring curtain glazing, parking at the back, garden there. And of course, we argued, we were despaired by this whole idea, and we managed to convince them to go into the big footprint building, and it raised a lot of interesting issues for us because this was, when we were just liberalizing our economy and everyone wanted the icons of globalization. And I felt that this company was so well situated, they were very sophisticated people, that they could build their own, confidently build their own identity, not responding to the sort of globalized materials, but actually beginning to pick up on the traditions that occurred in the area of Coimbatore, which is in South India, where this building occurs. And so the building is very low in scale. You can visually penetrate the entire building through a series of courtyards, and it doesn't disturb the streetscape in that people, as you can see in this image, yet don't feel threatened by it, can sit comfortably along its edge. Sorry, these are burnt out a bit, but it's sort of organized around a series of courtyards, and this is a sort of progression through the courtyards. It's got a large sort of roof which holds the top of it, and these courtyards actually have water which help to cool the building, so it's sort of passive cooling, and that's what the spaces feel like. It's all ventilated corridors. The offices are just one room deep, so you have natural ventilation. There's about a 6 or 7 degree centigrade difference between the outside and inside because this is in the rain shadow. It's very dry, and just the circulation of water, the noise of water, has an incredible cooling effect on the building. And the verandas or the circulation spaces are what are used for meetings, or people come out to meet each other from the 7 or 8 offices of this corporation that are housed there. And as you go into the building, it gets more intimate, where the management sits, who are the owners of the building. It's a large family. It's a family-owned building, so it sort of alludes to a house, and the scale changes completely. But it's naturally ventilated. It's got air conditioning provision, but they use it when they need to, which is very, very, very minimal. It also uses the local materials of the area, like it's a 20,000 square foot clay tile roof with 2 sets of clay tiles, one a decorative and the other a regular tile, a roof tile, so that you get insulation, but you also get these patterns. And I believe at the time it was done in 1995, 96, it was the largest tiled roof being built in India because people were only building those for homes, and they'd abandoned the use of this very simple, very beautiful material. And also granite, for example, we use granite from the local quarries, but we trimmed the edges where you had the drilling from the quarries to create the waterfall. So you got the ripple effect just out of the edges of the granite. So no material was really wasted, and that really was a constraint we set ourselves, and it really worked out that the waterfall needed something like this. And of course, art of many kinds was incorporated. This is the Cosmic Egg, which is a very precious piece, which was sort of displayed. These are 10-meter, 20-meter wide murals which are painted by traditional painters from Kerala that don't even use a sketch. They have poetry they recite while they, over 10 or 15 days, construct these murals. So we kind of incorporated a whole range of craft. This is what would be traditionally made in cloth, but it has 104 Lakshmis, because Lakshmi is the name of the company, which is the goddess of wealth, of course. And the 104 Lakshmis are sacred, and so that's the figure that was used. And Manjit Bawa, who was one of India's well-known painters, who he only painted on canvas, worked with us, that's him in that image, worked with us to translate his figures to create railings for the building. So all the railings in the building are his figures that sort of, they're the scenes from forests and animals that sort of dance through the space. We also use scrap metal from their machine tool companies to create what are traditional jalis or screens that facilitate natural ventilation, and we created about 24 patterns with different artists using scrap metal from the machine tool plant, which sort of we salvaged as they were sort of doing their pressings for different components of their machines, and that sort of created a whole vocabulary of screens right through the building, and the porosity of the screens changed depending on where they were placed in the building, if they were in front of toilets or in offices. So depending on the porosity and the transparency, the layering was what we played with, and it was constructed in a way that it could be dismantled easily, to be cleaned periodically, etc., including this sort of large end portal. And so this is really, it's a global program, and this was an extreme because we got engaged with this not only at the beginning of our own practice, but also at the beginning of the liberalization of the economy in India. And we felt very strongly about resisting what might be these sort of global images that sort of land on our doors, this is not our project, but these are the kinds of things that sort of are beginning. And this is in Jaipur, which goes up to about 46 degrees centigrade. And it's mad, and these are IT centers, and with information technology in places like Bangalore, everything is being built like this, which are just basically wrappers. And it's ridiculous because when you go into these buildings, they have very expensive blinds, which have to come down, otherwise you get glare on your computers. So you don't get the view out there, so why are you using the glass? So it's really related to image, and it's extremely expensive. And so after this, we got this project for Hewlett Packard from Palo Alto, but they were building in Bangalore, and we got appointed to do the second phase of their campus. The first phase was built by another Indian architect, which followed the same pattern that I just criticized, and therefore I will not name him. Basically, it's a glass wrapper with everything air-conditioned. And we began to analyze it, and we found what you see in yellow is the workstation areas where you need flexibility and you need air conditioning because the computers are housed there. The rest are meeting rooms and pantries and toilets and things like that, which it's ridiculous to include them as part of that wrapper. So we sort of proposed creating a street where we strung out all these things so they became more communal, where people could interact. They're very young people who work there. I mean, they have kids who are from 20 to 26 who work there. And the way these buildings are organized is that there is no social interaction between these young people. And so it's a terrible environment to really work in. And so by creating a social space with all the meeting rooms cantilevered off that street, and then what we did was organize the workstations with generators and other backup machines back there, with courtyards, water, food courts, and a whole narrative which sort of allowed a completely different experience of the building. I'm sorry some of this is burnt out, but this is where the work areas are. These are gardens between the work areas, which also insulate the buildings. We did all this in masonry. We use no glass there. These are food courts that are completely naturally ventilated. This is a waterfall here. That's a water body there. This is a big open courtyard, and there's cross ventilation that goes right through it. They haven't yet put, this building is 10 years old now. They haven't yet put air conditioning. This is all the services. Those are the generators and backup. That's a training center, naturally ventilated. And this is the street at 4 levels, which has conference rooms, it has staircases, and this is all naturally ventilated with water there. And it creates a completely different environment. And just to go back to the idea of the LEED, we couldn't get a LEED certification on this because it just didn't meet the parameters. We didn't have the budget for insulated glass, etc. But business as usual is about 200 square feet per ton of air conditioning. That's the thumb rule we work with. If you have an efficient system, that means you comply to the LEED requirements, you go up to about 270 or 280, and they're willing to give you a gold certificate based on that. We went up to 705 square feet per ton, but we did it not by mechanical or chemical fixes. We just reduced the amount of area that had to be air conditioned. So it's a no-brainer, but it doesn't fit the thinking of the code for that reason, because it sort of is very universalizing. And so then we this freed us up to develop an architectural vocabulary of volumes, of masses, that kind of created an interest for the building, because it is a mega structure, but also tried to break scale down. And that's what the building looks like. It sits along these trees. These are conference rooms that are cantilevered. The stairs are clad in copper, so they've now got patternized, and it sort of goes with the green. But it's a whole palette of materials rather than that one sort of glass surface. When you walk under it, it sort of is a different experience. The staircases, like I said, they're in copper. From the conference rooms, you sort of sit within green because they cantilever out, and they've been positioned such that they took advantage of the existing trees. And then, of course, the air conditioning, like I said, so what you see in gray here is all non-air conditioned. So the only air conditioned spaces are those and some of the conference rooms because they have video facilities, et cetera. So that's the reduction of the space that is air conditioned. And that's what let this go up to 705 square feet per ton of air conditioning universally on the whole campus. And of course, in that street, then you can play with architecture, with light, with volumes, with places people can sit on, different materials. It's more social. People meet. People can see each other. They can set up points of meeting, rendezvous points. And it sort of sets up a completely different vocabulary, which in the other building I showed you is an impossible thing to achieve. And that's what the dining rooms feel like. They're different pockets and niches where you have more privacy. You look at gardens. It's all naturally ventilated. And then, of course, the green was also used in a way strategically to help with that insulation. We had a natural cover of trees here, so that was easy, but within the courtyards, within the block. So this is where the software blocks are. The windows were just at eye level, so when you work on your desk, you see the green. The rest, you don't have blinds, you have none of that. It's very cool with very little air conditioning. These are where the generators are. These are the mechanical boxes at the end, and you get these sort of very thick gardens which insulated. There are points you can go into the garden to meet. The gardens are quite different, so there are no lawns which need high maintenance. This is just natural landscapes which grow wild, and you can trim it, you can play with it as you want. And so I think that really was, I think, the main contribution there, which was making that shift in terms of what needed to be air conditioning and setting up a whole new vocabulary as a result. That led us to another project in Hyderabad, which is interesting. That's a building by Mario Botta. These are IT buildings that are springing up. They're exactly like the buildings I showed you, or that building in the blue glass that I showed you. And we got this site for an infrastructure company. And that was very interesting because they're in the building construction industry. They've just set up. They're young people. They wanted this sort of global image thing. And of course, these were the two paradigms we looked at. This is what I call the architecture of impatient capital, which gets created really quickly. And what you notice here are nets. These nets are built because there are riots in Hyderabad now, and these are the buildings to attack, because all you need to do is to stone that facade, and you've achieved a lot. So now, when the vendors sell you the curtain glazing, they sell you details for the net and the canopies to protect the glass, and it's kind of developing a whole aesthetic. And so that is what we, of course, rejected. What we were inspired by was this little hut. And this is wonderful. It's in Jaipur, which is a comparable hot climate. It's a thatch hut with someone who sits in there with large containers of water. They keep dousing this hut with water to cool it. So it stays really cool. The water stays really cool. And this person has a little kettle here. So that's why you see the stains. If you go out and you put your hand out for water, they pour water into your hand and you can drink. So it's a manually operated water cooler. And it's completely cooled using the natural principle of evaporation. That is that this thatch is just, it's cooling by evaporation. And so that was something that was really inspiring. So we picked up on that, and we came up with a solution of actually doing a building with a green wall. But this is not a green wall as we see green walls which are sort of stuck on the facade, but this is a green facade which has a misting system built into it. I'm sorry, again, you can't see it here, but you can see some of those things there, the indication, which cools this building periodically, again, through evaporation. And so that's what the building we came up with. But then we expanded that to create a whole vocabulary of see if we can adjust this a bit. Is it possible to adjust the colors a bit, Doug, or too complicated? These are burning out. Okay, anyway, and so we created, through looking at many species that were local, we created on every facade a different pattern, with flowering species, some non-flowering species, with the idea that the building wouldn't be recognizable every time you went back 3 or 4 months later. It would be dynamic, based on the seasons. And so in the winter, it would burn out and allow the sun in, and in the summer, it would get really thick. And then it was 3 layers, which was the planting, a trellis, and a spec building, a really simple spec building. And that's what the building looks like. We sort of constructed a ground, and these are hydroponic trays that you see, and this is scaffolding. You know, in India, it's interesting. We hadn't done a building this high. All our buildings, as you saw, were quite low strung. And I was always frightened because everywhere I looked in India and I saw 5 and 6 and 7-story building, they looked beautiful while the scaffolding was up. And as soon as the scaffolding came down, they looked terribly made. And that's why people use this alico bond and glass, because it's a way of predicting a good level of finish. And so we thought, then that's how this idea of the trellis and trying to construct something sort of came about. And so that's sort of what we imagined with the trellis and the green on this ground. And so we spent a lot of time constructing the trellis. And again, we didn't want to give it to a big corporation. We didn't want to build it in a big city. We built it near Hyderabad, in a little village, in that little shed that this guy built specially to make the trellises. So that was nice because it employed 15 people. It was all handmade, of course, using whatever dyes and processes that you need for aluminium, but we didn't want to do it as finished aluminium, so it's textured. It sort of feels very handmade. It's very carefully constructed to incorporate the misting system, the plumbing systems that control it. But it's all handmade by 10 or 15 craftsmen in that little village, and then transported very close to the site. And that's what sort of the finished product sort of looked like just when it was finished. And you can see the profiles of the trellis. You can see how now the plants are beginning to grow. This was just finished about 5 or 6 months ago. The building in section is also, it's not a spec building. It has a series of courtyards that allow the building to breathe naturally. And so they also become like atriums. And that's sort of some of the interior views of the building. These atriums have skylights that bring in light, so you have natural lighting. You can see the green on the edges. And one of the interesting moves was we put the gym for the building right in the middle of the cafeteria, so people work out and watch each other eat and are really conscious about what they do. And so it was sort of a move. And now it's beginning to get populated. You can see the flowers of different colors and the patterns. We're beginning to light it using woks, which are very inexpensive, for which street food is made using these woks. And we've been doing studies where we're going to light it. And so it'll be lit based on the species. So based on the species, you'd sort of produce light that is appropriate. And the patterns are beginning to appear with the different colors of the flowers, as you can see. And this is a walkway where a gardener can actually walk and work without disturbing the office. So it's a completely separate facade with hydroponic trays and its own misting system that sort of protects the building. And for me, again, this idea of softening thresholds. So you have gardeners working, you have the CEO in a meeting. You have these worlds sort of subtly collide on a daily basis, because this needs upkeep, which for me is a really important moment, and one that we've encouraged. And I think, again, the clients begin to understand this after a point, and it's really sort of interesting. And that's when the misting system is on. It actually cools the building, and you can control the amount of misting depending on the temperature and how you want it to sort of cool. And we are beginning to do studies. We've got young scientists now mapping this through the months to actually see what the performative aspects of the building would be, and then to try to fine-tune it. And as the planting also grows, we begin to start studying what species needs how much water and how one can calibrate this a little better. I then go to the last section of the talk, which is these local programs and how do you globalize them? Because local programs come out of contingencies in very, very, very clear localities, which throw up all sorts of problems that sometimes don't have a universal solution. And the tendency, and these are NGOs and many other parts of civil society that engage with the improvement of these conditions. But they tend to be caricatured as being local. So you begin to, as architects, or get pushed into a position where as architects you begin to engage with vernacular imagery and aesthetics. You begin to caricature actually the condition, which I find problematic. And therefore, I think this idea of globalizing local programs is something we've been very interested in. And this is an institute we did for the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in a very remote village, Tulzapur. It's about 500 kilometers from Mumbai, but inland, very dry. And what we tried to do here was experiment with passive cooling through wind towers and picking up on local vocabularies there, which is a rich man's house. And the only thing that is celebrated is the entrance, which is the kind of vocabulary we followed here. And I think in retrospect, this is about a 15-year-old project, and it had many problems. Passive cooling really needs a severe change in lifestyle. And I think that's the reason why we rely so much on mechanical fixes. And this becomes a really interesting question. We also experimented using ferrocement walls, which we constructed on site to train local people so that this module could be then perpetuated. It's much, much cheaper, and it's a kind of modular construction, and the fill there gives you the insulation in that climate. So it's sort of also a climatic response for the housing. By adding a terrace room, you begin to respond to the climate and add another space at very little cost. And it sort of sits in a kind of fortified condition with internal courtyards and this sort of system of cooling through water again, but much more subtle. And I must say it wasn't as successful as we thought, only because these are students who have lifestyles that sort of are hard to sort of control, and so it's not as efficient as one was being idealistic and trying these sort of systems. And then in a hot, humid climate, we sort of experimented, which is I think more successful in Goa, in a very remote part of Goa, a think tank for 12 people to be given out to intellectuals, to institutions where they can take people for really sort of introspective sort of discussions. And this is just a big roof, because here, as long as you have air moving through in the hot climate, humid climate of Goa, you begin to get cooling. And so they're just a series of rooms. The decks actually become places people meet, or you can use for yoga. It's like a big hut with these sort of rooms that sit in very frugal and creates a whole series of sort of, I think, interesting spaces with different light modulations for moments of repose and discussion. A tube that forms the entrance, which is in copper. Copper is sort of associated with therapy and healing in India. People put water in a copper pot, and so this is also meant as a place where executives would go in small groups from companies or from institutions to do these sort of workshops. And here again, taking this idea of weathering, and we use sort of the local laterite material, which has high iron content, and so it darkens and weathers and gets patternized over age. The second sort of, or the third project here is one for slum children, which is a whole different condition, where these slum children, I mean, it's amazing just looking at that boy, how intact they are in spite of this incredibly deplorable physical condition. And so an NGO we got involved with called Magic Bus, they have 6 red magic buses, and they take kids from the slums to this campus where they recreate, and they teach them about hygiene, about nutrition, and they play, and so it's meant for a weekend, but here for slum children. And so what we did was we sort of constructed this series of pavilion, but the constraint we set ourselves was that we would use materials that exist in the slum only as our palette, but we would reconfigure them in ways that these young people would see familiar materials, but used in more sophisticated ways, almost implying that if they did get engaged with the construction of their own habitat or the improvement of their own habitat, that this would be lessons they might sort of implicitly learn or imbibe. And so we also imagine them through Photoshop as we were designing, in this case, a dormitory, at how they might get implanted in slums as a typology where, for example, the dormitory, which you see here, could also be a public toilet with a community space in a slum condition, so that as a type, they were neutral enough that they could have a wide array of applications. And so you then use this project, because the constituency is the same, to see how it might actually recycle itself as a type in useful ways with this frugal use of material, because these are very, very simple materials. This is what the dormitory sort of looks like. The base of the the windows are based on bunk beds. The dining facilities, which is just an open veranda with a portal where you could put a plastic sheet or matting so you could extend it in the summer or in the monsoon. There you see the pavilions, but it's very, very frugal, again, of materials that are used in these places and are familiar, in a sense, to the inhabitants of these places. The cladding, which is just metal siding or boarding or very, 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 very kind of light frame, then that gets clad with, in this case, just GI galvanized metal, so it's not stainless steel or more expensive metals, which makes the kind of gateway to the institution. And then how, again, this type, like I said, gets embedded in the slum, which led us to getting engaged with this condition in the slum, which is the constituency or the location these kids were coming from. And for us to go back there as we were mining our textures from here were also, it's making us really aware of the problems there. And you know, again, children, these are the same kids, and you can see this guy, he's ready to go to school, he's clean, white socks, bright, but he lives in that sort of condition. It's just absolutely incredible that that's even possible. And they're the same kids who go to the Magic Bus campus. But how could we do something here? So we started working with SPARK, which is an NGO, and the National Slum Dwellers Federation. And we started looking at the condition. And it's amazing that according to the UN Human Development Report, there's one toilet for 1,440 people in Mumbai. And according to this NGO, it was 1:800. According to the Bombay Municipal Corporation, it's 1:148. And the Bombay Municipal Corporation targets 1:50. So even 1:50 is absolutely amazing to think that there are 50 people using one toilet seat. So it's mind-boggling. That is really the right number. And so we said this is what we should get engaged with, and we began studying. These are what the toilets look like, and no one uses them. So everyone defecates out in the open. And it's a terrible, terrible situation. And the World Bank and big agencies are putting a lot of money. So we evolved this sort of type where we stacked it. We put the caretaker of the toilet on the terrace, gave him the penthouse in the slum. And there's always a caste question here because the lowest caste is the one who is looking after the toilets. But by giving him the penthouse, you privilege them completely in terms of engaging them with the maintenance of the toilet with that move. And what we did was we attached a community space to that area so that children and women can use that space. And I got one of my clients who we had done a house for to donate solar panels so it goes off the grid. And that's really important because it allows children then at night to go and study there, or women to do adult education classes, and a whole spectrum of things, which agencies like Magic Bus are trying to compensate within these sort of the deficiency of these social institutions. So we thought if we could do something in that locale, it could be quite incredible. And so that's just a Photoshop image, but we did this for about 8 locations, and I can, in the question and time, if we have time, I can talk about it. But there was a lot of resistance from the government because signaling something is also like building a constituency, which means the resistance for the slum to be removed becomes that much greater. Because once you have a community center there, it's threatening for agencies that people might organize themselves in much more, fierce ways because they would have a much greater sense of community once you begin to have an icon. And we sort of used the idea from the building of cladding the toilet. It's separate by 4 feet with flowers, which sort of completely changes the association of the toilet because you have flowers which are scented, etc. And we've built one very small one as a start, which has got done just a few weeks ago. And we're going to see how this works, and hopefully I can spend part of my summer negotiating this through. And I'm going to just end with this last project, which is a project we've been doing recently, and that's the client. Both those people are the clients. Again, this question of the local program, and this is a really complex project. It's in Jaipur, and it's for 100 elephants and their keepers, which are called mahuts. They're all Muslims. The state of Rajasthan is a right-wing Hindu state, and it's a very, very difficult question because these elephants are here by an accident of history. The Mughals bought them for ceremony. They're tropical beings that they have no business being in the desert, and they suffer there greatly. And these guys are poor. He would earn 5,000 rupees a month, which is less than $100, and he has a family to support and the elephant to look after. The elephant owners who are a little richer, and they take some of the profit. These elephants take tourists up the Amber Palace and other locations in Jaipur. And that's how they're currently housed, where all the elephants, like in a garage, are stacked here. The mahouts live up there. And that's problematic because the mahout and the elephant's relationship is incredibly complex. There's no one who can control an elephant but the mahout, and it takes years to develop that relationship. And so they begin to start living there because they have to be near their elephant, and this is a complete disaster. And so NGOs in Rajasthan put a lot of pressure on the government, and they instituted a competition, and we won the competition because we didn't talk about the architecture, and it was, I think, 5 or 6 architects. This is the site they gave us, and when I saw the site by Google, we realized that's the site. And it was a site. It told me 2 things. One is the site was full of voids because the sand contractors had illegally quarried the site for all the sand. It's beautiful sand for construction. And so it was a very difficult site. And that, because of the topography, the water was all flowing through the site. And that was, I mean, again, a no-brainer. And so our project was about the landscape, about how we could reconstruct the landscape. And that's what it looked like. And these are all the voids. And so we sort of said, let's concentrate on creating a habitat for these elephants. And it was a very hard thing to do because it's a public works department project. There's a lot of corruption with the government. And so when I said, let's dig some holes and collect some water and put some plants to start with, the contractors, the public works department thought, my God, this is disaster for us. And so what they did was, without telling us, they started constructing the houses first because the kickbacks are in the houses. Luckily, the government fell. And we had managed to, and the project stopped, and we had managed to dig one big hole. And for 3 years, that hole collected water, and the landscape began to generate itself. And we've just restarted in the project, and that government has been reinstituted, and now it's beginning to take some traction. So that's what we did. We concentrated on creating micro dams for the water, and in the interstitial spaces, really putting the houses and the architecture, and kind of evolved a quite complex plan with different species depending on their proximity to water. And that's the house for the elephant. And it's sort of, that's where the elephant lives. The allocation of space for the mahout is only 200 square feet. So what we did was just made a small room, a kitchen, gave them a big courtyard, gave them a collective courtyard, and added a stair so they could build on the terrace. And in the demonstration unit, we showed how those pavilions could be added. We used Photoshop a lot to convince the government of the necessity for the landscape, etc. Some of it worked, some of it just worked by default. And of course, the elephants were really cooperative. We used them to establish the size. It was just wonderful, actually, working with them because, I mean, how do you, and the elephants can't lie on flat ground because they can't get up, so they always lie. When they lie down on berms, and so you have to engineer the floor very subtly to create enough of a berm that the elephant can get up. So the learning curve was incredible. And so the houses were built. This was the pond that we just dug out on one of the quarries. And the elephants began enjoying it. But they didn't move here for 3 years, but they would come there every day from the palace when they had their time off, just to enjoy the water. Their health changed completely by the fact that they could use water, because they never had water they could bathe in for all the years they'd been there. And it was absolutely incredible. And I would go always with my resignation letter from the project in my pocket, because every time I'd go there, they would do something really perverse on the architecture, which I wanted to just sort of say nothing. But then I'd go there and I'd see these elephants bathing and things, and I would say, no, you've got to do this. You've got to win this project. And so we kept going. And that's what the site was when we got it. That's what the site looks like today. It's completely transformed just because of that pond that we created. It's amazing, the transformation in the area. We went into an aggressive tree planting thing. Birds are beginning to arrive there and get attracted. There's a whole ecology that is sort of developing around this landscape. And now they're beginning to move in. 5 or 6 months, they started allocating houses to the elephants, and they've begun to sort of live there. The white markings you see is because of the color that they use on the elephant. It actually distorts their skin, and it's terrible. And that's how you have that marking. But the landscape has changed enormously. We are now beginning to stabilize these walls, which is the work that has started, and that's a salutation from our friend there. And so this sort of process of bathing the elephants is very, very important for the bonding between the elephant and the keeper, because these are not easy animals to control. And the water has contributed enormously to establishing and deepening that relationship, besides just the well-being of the elephants in this sort of environment as the ecology changes and families are beginning to move in, they're beginning to alter and create partitions. They sort of store the thatch on that roof so it insulates the roof. And it's a whole different environment for, what I would say are really poor families. You can see here they begin to use that to store it for insulation. That's the elephant. And the elephant can't come into this courtyard because that's where the children play. They have a separate entrance out there. So that segregation was very important. And now we are beginning to work a visitor center out. We found a lot of archival materials as this place started getting established. The Mahouts started bringing out documents, archival documents that go back 100, 200 years of remedies for sicknesses and disease and stuff. So there's going to be a visitor center, which we just started doing the drawings for that, which will allow tourists to also come and look at all of this, but from that point, see the elephants bathing in these sort of water bodies, which is sort of a really beautiful moment, and that sort of is what has inspired this visitor center that we are beginning to sort of draw up. And then, now they're beginning to pitch the water bodies, and the locals have got involved, the keepers are beginning to get involved, and it's sort of set off a whole process which has sort of changed the dynamics of the project, because even the government is paying attention. And it was a real shift, because it was really a realization that in a project like this and in conditions like this, architecture can't be the only thing that's privileged, and to sort of reestablish through landscape and just water as a resource, a new ecology was really very, very important. And so just in conclusion, I would say that, as the world and South Asia in particular, I think India is becoming increasingly global, I think we have to be cautious about accepting that things are growing more alike, because they begin to look more alike. Because when we engage with the deeper excavation of the site, the people, etc., the sites that we operate on, and we use an understanding that draws on both the objective reality as well as the subjective perceptions of the site, the differences emerge even more strikingly than before, where differences were actually assured when things look different. And so this is something that we have to be very cautious about, and I think it's a great space for us to sort of operate in. Architects will have to, I think, find, as a result, a more rigorous way of defining the complex emerging cultural fabric of multiple aspirations in landscapes like this, the Indian, the mutinous democracy of India. And more importantly, to see this cultural fabric as ever evolving as a landscape. And that's why I think to how does one actually globalize these local programs, because then I think those lessons resonate more universally, and I see that in work happening in Haiti, in Africa, in other places. I think we have to resist from caricaturing the local. In the words of Arjun Appudurai, the social anthropologist, he said, culture is a dialogue between aspirations and sedimented traditions. So in these interpretations that we as designers make of a place or of a cultures, ideas of the future, as much as those about the past, necessarily have to be embedded and, more importantly, nurtured. This highly pluralistic environment, which is society, culture, the economic environment, etc., of the Indian landscape, I think requires planning and design mechanisms and attitudes that continually negotiate between the differences. That is, architecture is the sole instrument for placemaking, and the temporality that creates conditions for habitations and celebrations. These are not binaries, but these are simultaneous negotiations, or between the state and the market, or between the empowered and the poor, rather than allowing any one entity to prevail and remake the city in its image. This is what makes working in Mumbai and the landscape of India, I think, unique and very challenging, and one that I enjoy very much. Because I think once the architect sees these various differences as being simultaneously valid, the challenge is then how to go beyond their polarized binaries, because we tend to set them up as polarized binaries, and these are non-productive. And I believe that's truly the space in which we'll be able to engage with architecture and society more meaningfully. Thank you very much. Thanks. be happy to take some questions. I think we have some time. Shout if the mic doesn't reach you.
Okay, I'll start my question. One of the most striking images that I found in your presentation was that domestic skyscraper that was rising above the slums in Mumbai, and it was shown to illuminate different densities of habitation. And I've always found it to be like a disturbing project for a lot of reasons, but I didn't realize that it was pitched as like a kind of a green, sustainable project. In that rendering, there were solar panels and green roofs and stuff. And I also realized that something that I didn't realize before was that if that building was built in Midtown Manhattan, it would just be banal or even hailed as progressive because of its sustainable features.
Right.
And I was wondering, first how we can even interpret buildings like that in another culture when it's commonplace to us, but suddenly looks so different in another environment.
Yeah.
I guess my question is how we can see foreign environments as outsiders when our perspective is so warped.
Yeah, well, first, just to put you at ease that it was only in the Photoshop renderings that it had all those green features. They never built it like that. So that's out of the way. It's I don't know. It's hard to look at it. I mean, the way I sort of explain some of this is it's the brashness of the sudden liberalization of our economy and sort of embracing the capitalist world and trying to speak to the capitalist world at a decibel level to be heard. And so I think in societies like India or societies which operated under socialism for a long time, and I don't mean to say that East Europe and India would be similar because India has a whole completely different cultural sort of fabric that it operates in. The built environment was never the outlet for ostentation in these societies. And there were many other modes. So that's why weddings operate the way they do, and they become so important as spectacles in our city, whether they're festivals or weddings, and the kind of temporal events, because those were the outlets for ostentation. Jewelry was a great outlet, and that's why you have such beautiful jewelry that comes out of there, or weddings, jewelry. Education in the last 2 decades of our socialist sort of operations, it was education. It's amazing, and that's why you see so many Indians as doctors and in the IT industry, because parents put a whole life savings just to educate their kids. And so the built environment, when we started liberalizing our economy, the built environment was seen to be necessary, not only because there were new programmatic requirements that needed new forms of infrastructure, but it also became a way to speak to the broader capitalist world. And that's why its transfer is so literal. And I think this is a case of, in this case, the Ambani family, who are one of the biggest industrialists, wanting to sort of just say that they've arrived. And it's highly problematic, and it creates incredible ruptures there. In terms of infrastructure, it happened so fast that no one even could react. People were so stunned they couldn't react. And I don't expect someone from the outside to even understand it. We are barely figuring it out ourselves.
You did some planning for elephants. What about all of the cattle that are wandering through all the cities in India that I've been to practically? The cows just wander up and down. They lay along the median streets. How do you accommodate something like that?
You don't. You accommodate them the way they are. I mean, they enjoy themselves. They're looked after. People feed them. They're sacred. So you'll see in Mumbai, people feeding the cows grass, and it's sort of, they're sacred. So they have their space. They find shelter. They find food. The poor elephants didn't, and they were sort of, I think, mistreated, and that was the problem. And that's how this project evolved. I mean, I hope it lands on its feet, but that's what sort of triggered it off.
Talked about appreciating the craftsmanship that's still alive, and also about the practice of vastu.
Yeah.
And then you also mentioned really briefly about the limitations. Hi, Doug.
Could you speak more about the tension between the desire to conserve these traditional practices of craft and vastu
Right.
with the things you mentioned briefly about things that are holding them back?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the Vastu is sort of disconnected from this. I think the craft is one issue, the Vastu is another issue. The Vastu comes from, and I'll get that out of the way first because it's simpler in some ways, is it's you know, that landscape I showed you of the new cities in the southern states, that's where it exploded. And it exploded because you had very quick formation of wealth, and you had agrarian societies moving into the urban areas and engaging with industry, and they kind of held on to any clutch to succeed, to cover all their bases, so to speak. It's the aspirin principle. It can't do you any harm, only good. Take it, you know. And so it's this sort of attitude. It's just a desperation to succeed, and to succeed in a societal climate which is completely alien. These are first generation agrarian kind of shifts, you know. And so that's why it's sort of resurrected itself so powerfully in these places. That there's a sort of belief in it, it's also distorted. Sorry.
Feel it has a negative impact? I mean, I built a project in Coimbatore, actually,
Oh,
and
okay.
the Vastu was the first thing. I mean, we had to consult.
Okay. So let me say this. In my study of Vastu, I think like Feng Shui, it probably had a scientific or more rational basis. I believe Feng Shui too is geomancy, and you know, this was codified. The difference is that those scientific principles in India were the messengers for that were the priests, that it got co-opted by religion, and therefore it got distorted. So the basic principles of Vastu you can't argue with. Put the kitchen in the east for the morning sun, the master bedroom in the southwest, the highest point so that you get good breeze. There are 5 or 6 things like that that make sense. It's commonsensical. But then it begins to start getting distorted. It begins to get misused by the practitioners because that's related to their own income and, you know, all of that. The kind of vested interests that form around any form of specialization, I suppose. And so it's got distorted to a point that's beyond belief, that it's becoming a power struggle between architects and the consultant who's sort of being employed for the Vastu thing. Because if you know, we've done so many buildings using Vastu, we actually get it completely right, but then when it's taken to the consultant, he finds 6 things wrong with it, which we know are not wrong, but how would he justify his fee? So it's a sort of catch-22 situation. No, seriously, it's becoming a racket, just to use that simple word. As far as crafts go, I think, like I said, that the celebration of crafts is the extension of the vernacular. And so when we do conservation projects, for example, it maps on seamlessly because you're extending precisely those crafts, as I showed you in some images. And in fact, the craftsmen are much more empowered intellectually and even in terms of comprehension than we are as architects in understanding how something should operate, what are the material compositions. I mean, that thing on the camel grinding the lime, that's what the craftsmen told me. They said, don't use the cement mixer to grind the lime, which is what we were doing because it has to be slower to match, to get the red color, to match the sandstone of the building, etc. So now that's local knowledge that you mine if you're open. And that's why I connected to modes of practice, models of practice, because in different models of practice, as an architect, as a trained architect, in the formal tradition, you have to change your equation with who you're dealing with because the transmission of knowledge changes. You know, in a global practice, you transmit the knowledge electronically as definitive working drawings which land on a site, then they manifest themselves in a building. In other kinds of projects, you can't do that. In other circumstances, you can't do that. And that's what I meant by models of practice. That is, how do you alter your own perceptions and expectations of operating in a terrain differently, where you're sometimes not the central player in the transmission of instruction even, but you become a facilitator of another kind. And so I think crafts in that condition work well if you're willing to accept that equation. With our new materials, and that's how when we were doing that trellis, we began to see how we can extend some of those ways of operation to newer materials. And therefore, you know, so if you use Alico bond or curtain glazing, you go to a vendor, they ship it from Singapore or Australia, presto, it's there and it's done. But how can you actually use these materials like aluminum or other forms of metal, also stone, because now you can do much more with stone with digital fabrication, CNCs, laser cutting. How do you make those interfaces that you don't stifle innovation? And there are younger architects who are doing some of that. But unfortunately, what gets exposed to the West, what gets exposed as the celebration of the crafts in India, is with wood. It's with many traditional crafts used in traditional forms, which doesn't extend the tradition, it preserves it. And so my argument is in the application of preservation, it's a valid strategy, but otherwise we are stifling craft if we're applying it in such literal ways to contemporary projects.
I'm stuck. The range of things you have dealt with and the depth of your understanding.
Thank you.
Just absolutely stunning.
Thanks.
I think one point, if you would expand a little bit more, is the local and global. I think that's very interesting, and I didn't quite understand. So if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I see it through program. In fact, I'll fall back on an idea that Charles Correa had sort of used to describe this. He called it transfers versus transformations, where he said sometimes, and he was speaking in the context of the 80s in a completely different context, where things just get transferred. In other cases, if there is local intelligence that can resist it, then there's a transformation that occurs which sort of roots it. And so I sort of, inspired by that kind of imagination of some of the flows of ideas, I began to become very conscious about this in the context of program. That's why I sort of divided it as, because, you know, you have, I mean, the IT industry, we don't have precedents in our tradition to deal with some of that, right? And so that's why there's such a appropriation of those forms even in almost a mindless way. And so that's why that attempt was to see that if you took the climate of Bangalore, where you don't need air conditioning and you don't air condition everything, and you use air and water to cool these places, you use vegetation to create new sensibilities, you're sensitive to, you know, these 20-year-olds sitting at a computer screen for 20 hours a day. How do you get them out into that street so they connect with their other sensibilities, and they can smell things and they can hear water and they can feel the air. Otherwise, they're living in these bizarre environments in those containers. And so I think there are many local forces all the way from the intangible, which have to do with culture, and my reading of culture, my explanation of culture is that those are the implicit rules in a society. They're not explicit, and that's why they keep transforming, because those are rules we establish and they change with time. So it's all the way from culture to climate to material to, you know, all of that. How can you infect in a positive way these global programs with some of those parameters? I think that creates a much, much richer and much more sustainable condition. I believe that building, not only does it perform better, but I think it sits better. People are happier. And there's a blog, actually, you can go to it, and it's interesting to see young people comment on the building and the food courts and the environments versus when they worked in a glass building. It's very interesting. So that's a kind of first-hand feedback, and so that's very... And so the same thing with local programs. When we have, I mean, you know, that Magic Bus program, even the clients had imagined we'd make a village atmosphere, and that we would create nice thatched huts and platforms and trees where these kids would feel like they're in a village environment, which was very different from the slum. And I just thought that was the wrong way to approach it. It was falsifying it for them. But if you could use the buildings as a project of education, of familiarity, but I think also learn from it, because I do believe that those lessons of globalizing these local programs, which grow out of a very particular condition, that here you have to take slum dwellers out of the city to be able to take them away on the weekend, otherwise they're forced to work on the weekend. So this is a complex network that these NGOs create with the parents of these children, because it deprives the family of the weekend income, but they have to convince them that the benefits of these are much more. Then I think you trigger off other kinds of processes, and I think architecture can play a big role in doing that in the way we organize space.
But by calling it global, you mean it could be replicated at least everywhere?
I mean in its sensibilities, that it has aspirations that are beyond a caricature of what one sees in the locale. And I remember a student once asking me about civil society, which made me think a lot about it. Is that, I think civil society has the ability to do that. And we say civil society in a place. It's that part of society that's rooted, has responsibility and stake in the ground in a place, but also has the ability to negotiate and engage with more universal, more global questions and ways of doing things, etc. So I think many parts of Africa can learn from the Magic Box program, and therefore its expression. If its expression was thatched huts, the program itself won't have feet because it would be seen as a caricature of something. But the Magic Bus program, I think it resonates. It could resonate for Africa. It could resonate for many other parts of the world. And if it's expressed in a way that communicates that it has the ability and the power to do that, I think that is an important contribution we can make.
Consistent with this line of thinking, have you been forced into kind of workforce development to find the craftsmen with the strengths and volume that you needed for your work?
Very much. We don't employ them. We don't employ them on principle because I think independence is much more powerful in the way they evolve. So our office or our studio is rather small. But we have different craftspeople in different. We work through general contractors. We work sometimes directly with craftspeople. Sometimes we help the general contractors identify craftspeople and ensure that they have the appropriate craftspeople when we are doing particular projects. And yes, and I think in India there's a lot of work being done on this, but really through the track of conservation or historic preservation, where there are agencies now that are creating directories of these craftspeople and all of that. Because there's an array of materials that you can engage with. And this is very much happening, yes. And we do that, I would say, I think we do it consciously, but based on every project. So, because one of the things, as you can see from the range, and I've shown you only a part of our range, we've really done many other diverse kinds of projects, is each of these circumstances are different. When you're in Jaipur, the resources are quite different from when you're in Coimbatore, and you don't want to have a band that travels with you, and that's another form of not colonizing, but I think you have to go to a place and mine what might be the resource there, and that's what makes those buildings economical and all of that.
Thanks, Rahul, for this great lecture. I was wondering, you built obviously with a lot of human labor. So how do you think could it be transferred to the United States? Would you think it would change the society, the economies, and the aesthetics of our cities? What would be the changes?
When you say our cities, what do you mean?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, Anna tried doing this right outside Gand Hall, and so I should be asking you this question, Anna. What has that done to society here? Well, that's a hard question in the sense I think the condition of population and economy and all of that is, I think there's value in handmaking and in value in labor-intensive crafts, all of that, but it's also linked to economy and it's linked to aspiration. So yes, you and I can, as an architect, say, gosh, the building feels better, it's handmade and it's got richer textures. So we can, at that aesthetic level, appreciate it. So that's the easy one. The difficult one is how do you situate it in economies? And I think what can be learned is that, I think in many parts of the United States, in many parts of Europe, I think if architects began engaging with architecture in a way that it resisted mass production or industrialized products and began to see what might be ways that one can engage local crafts, you might have a resurrection and it might be linked to economy. But I think a lot of it comes out of necessity and therefore economy. And I think our intelligence would lie in entering that space at the right time to make a kind of synergetic condition which would allow that to happen. So, I think that's a very broad response, but I would just for now separate it into these two which we can't mix up. One is the economy or the building ecology, which I think is related to the economy, and the other is the aesthetics of it. And when you do something in Bangladesh, the beautiful thing is that it both maps onto each other perfectly. That's how you get that incredible product. And here, if you didn't have the student labor, you wouldn't have been able to build that.
Please join me in thanking Rahul.